Hi, welcome back, folks. This is Mission 5. I'm Matt Trokin, the Supervisor of Social Studies, grades 6 through 12.
I'm Jeff Ashina, the Math Supervisor, grades 6 through 12.
And I'm Chuck Sipe, Assistant Superintendent. In this mission, we're going to talk about assessments, specifically formative and summative assessments. We're going to talk a little bit about how they fit into our curriculum template, as well as how we can use them to inform our instruction and collaborate with one another.
And we'll begin, of course, by differentiating between formative and summative assessments. Formative assessments, of course, are those diagnostic tools that you use throughout the day and throughout your lessons, whether it's the exit ticket or it's the teacher observation of what students are doing, and certainly, moving you towards the summative assessment ultimately. How does that ultimately inform instruction?
Right. And then the culminating activity getting to your summative assessments is more towards the end of the unit. It's not the ongoing process. It's that culminating activity to allow students a chance and opportunity to demonstrate their mastery of the standards and skills that you have outlined throughout the entire unit.
So why are these important and how do they influence instruction? Well, we've talked a little bit about what they are, right, real quickly there. But so our formative assessment, those are those leverage points in the moment, both teacher and student driven, where we redirect instruction, we redirect the flow of a lesson, and sometimes it's in the moment in the lesson. Sometimes it's after a lesson, like an exit ticket, which you mentioned. And those summative assessments really help us demonstrate mastery, right? So both have a distinct influence on instruction. They just happen at different points. I referenced in video 1 something I heard a long time ago, which I thought was a really great way to explain it, the difference between formative and summative assessments. And formative assessment is when the chef tastes the soup. A summative assessment is when the customer tastes the soup. So that's kind of a good way to think about the differences there. So let's talk a little bit about how they drive instruction, what happens next. So Matt, why don't you guys tell us about how formative assessment can do that?
Well, certainly when you're going into formative assessment and you're conducting exit tickets or you're observing what students are doing in the moment, it's ultimately going to drive how you direct what's going on in your classroom and ultimately how it's going to shape the eventual summative assessment by knowing what students are doing in that moment and being able to take the pulse of the class at that given moment in time.
And it also gives you the opportunity for some anticipation of misunderstandings, which is important. We should be able to know where the faults are going to be in order to be well prepared for those moments. We could talk about formative assessment and being able to differentiate, being able to change on the fly, but if we're not anticipating those, that might be difficult for somebody to do.
Sometimes those formative assessment triggers are hard to write down in the moment. Those teacher observations, whole class responses, and those things are okay. Those are great formative assessment tools, and they should be included as strategies in our curriculum documents. But it's also important to specifically think about how we're going to use that information, how we're going to use that data. Something that's important for us to recognize is, and we'll talk a little bit more when we get to summative assessment, but all of our assessments inform grading. Right, and what's the point of grading? Well, grading should be our tool for reporting on mastery towards progress towards mastery of standards. And as we've talked about in our previous missions, the way our standards are connected to our enduring understandings, our essential questions, which connect right to the skills and knowledge. So if our grading doesn't directly reflect student progress towards mastery of standards, I'm not sure we're using grading effectively to communicate not only to students but also to parents about what that looks like. And that really comes back to feedback, right? So we haven't talked about grading and feedback a lot, so we'll just kind of drop them in quickly. We'll add some resources to this mission about that, but we know research on feedback tells us it needs to be timely, goal-oriented, actionable, a couple other characteristics. But those are the most specific. That really fits in with formative assessment, right? Right in that moment, how are we giving students specific feedback about how they can improve and also continue, right? We often forget that feedback can be about positive things. We can specifically inform about what they've done well and celebrate that and share that because the kids are always listening and learning. So we need to make sure that when we use assessments to appropriately inform grading, we're doing that well, and that we consider how important feedback is in that process, especially for things like homework, right? We use homework as a formative assessment. But if we don't provide feedback on it, it sometimes loses some of the real impact and influence it can have. So let's talk a little bit about summative assessment again.
So with summative assessment, that's really kind of where like the unit design really begins and lesson planning begins, because when you put together that summative assessment, you're trying to figure out what do we value within this unit, what standards, what skills, what do we want the kids to master, and to what level. In certain courses, maybe you want kids to master to a certain point, but then the next course, the mastery is that much deeper. Or even in the next unit or so on. So it's really like, even though it's the end and culminating activity, it's really where you should start when you come to your unit design.
So ultimately, going back to that summative assessment, but of course using that formative assessment to inform your instruction and provide that real-time feedback as you're taking the pulse of your class and your students.
Yeah, the other thing, we have one other piece of assessment data and memorialized on our curriculum document. That's benchmarking. Our focus here has been specifically on formative and summative assessment. We do want to memorialize benchmarking to culminate the entirety of our assessment. Benchmarking are those standardized diagnostic tools. We use IXL a lot throughout the district, and I think that that's great because it gives us specific information on student progress towards standards, right? We've talked about that a lot. But we have other benchmarking tools, and that we frequently think about final and midterm exams. While those may not always be the best measure of student progress, those once in a moment tests. What's been really great to see is lots of our secondary teachers moving towards tiered projects, ways that students can really demonstrate their learning, as opposed to that whole sit down and study for this huge test. There's value to that, but there's also value to an application opportunity. Right. So we do want to memorialize that in our curriculum document as well, in that benchmarking option. All right, so quick wrap up on formative and summative assessments, but hopefully this video has helped us to realize the difference between the two, how they fit into our curriculum template, as well as some ideas on how we can continue to leverage them to influence student achievement.
Yep.
All right.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you.